I have a 4.5-year-old grandson. He lives 10 minutes from me on an island off the coast of Washington State. And I walk with him often in the woods. And as I do that, I think to myself, what's this world going to look like when he's my age, six decades from now? And as I hear these stories tonight, and as I look around this world, I think, my God, if we continue like this, his life will be miserable. But we have the opportunity to change things. And so I want to move into the positive aspects of what I'm feeling about the world today, and I am positive. We are in extremely revolutionary times. You and I are living in perhaps the time of greatest revolutions mankind has ever known, and womankind. I think this revolution is bigger than the agricultural revolution or the industrial revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. We are in a revolution. Something amazing is happening today around the world. The Arab Spring is one incredible sign of it. The amazing democratic revolutions that have gone on in 10 Latin American countries. What's happening in China? I was just there. I go to Istanbul next week. I was in Istanbul 3 months ago. What's happening in Turkey? What's happening in Russia against Putin? What's happening in China? What's happening all over the world? People are waking up. And we are at a time in history, the first time in human history, when every single one of us on this planet is facing the same crises. We've never been here before. We used to have hurricanes in the Carolinas, still do, and tsunamis in Asia, but they didn't really affect each other, those countries, very much when that happened. But today, every single human being, in fact, every sentient being on this planet is impacted by climate chaos. The glaciers are melting, the oceans are rising, and every one of us is impacted by the fact that resources are declining at accelerating rates, and the prices of essentials like food and fuel are increasing at accelerating rates, and species are going extinct at terrible rates. Our populations are exploding. We're still fighting insane wars. For the first time in history, though, we're all impacted by this. Every creature on this planet is impacted by this. And for the first time, we're all communicating with each other. A few years ago, I was high up in the Himalayas at about 17,000 feet, standing next to a glacier that was receding, talking to a tribal chieftain who was lamenting the fact that his people would never have telephones because the lines couldn't reach that far. And I'd hear the same thing in the Amazon. I spent a lot of time in the Amazon. I organized a couple of nonprofits that work in both of those areas, Tibet and the Amazon. They would say the same thing in the Amazon, the telephone lines will never come here. Well, last week I talked to a chieftain deep in the Amazon by telephone. He's on a satellite cell phone, and so is that chieftain of the nomadic groups up in the Himalayas. We are all talking to each other. We're texting. We're whatever we're doing across the planet. We can even get languages translated on Google. We've never been here before. These are revolutionary times. We're all faced by the same crises. We're all communicating with each other. And we're beginning to totally understand that we are living on a very, very tiny, fragile space station. But unlike the space station that our astronauts built, this one hasn't got any shuttles. You can't get off it, and neither can my grandson, and neither will any of your children or grandchildren be able to get off it. We've got to take care of it. These are the times to do it. And we find ourselves today in very bad shape. Terrible economic crisis that's going on. The amazing hostility, the discrimination, what we heard about with this young man Hassan, and what we know is going on throughout the Middle East and throughout so much of the world, and you have experienced it. My heart is just aching being here because, I was talking to someone in the men's room after dinner, after the last conversation, and saying, I have a feeling that if I'd written Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and if I were Muslim, I'd be in the penitentiary. I know I'm privileged through nothing I've done of my own. I've come into this world and this country from 300 years of Yankees, Puritans, and that gives me a privilege that I don't deserve. And you are discriminated against through no fault of your own. And that's horrible. I cannot tolerate it. It is intolerable, and none of us should tolerate it. And this is part of where we must go. We know that we've created a failure. And I want to speak a little bit about the economics here, and I want to get into this business that the speech is built up to be about corruption in the Muslim world and economic hitmen. But having heard what I heard tonight, I had to speak that piece. We know we've created a failure on this planet. Our economic system is a total failure. One example, just one example, is that less than 5% of us live in the United States and we consume almost 30% of the world's resources, while half the world is starving or on the verge of starvation. That's not a model. You can't repeat it in China or India or Africa or Latin America. These countries may want to replicate what we've done, but they can't. 5% consuming 30% of the world's resources, the numbers don't add up. The rest of the world can't do it. We need another 5 planets, just like this one, without people. It's not going to happen. So we know what we've created is a failure. We know we have to change it. This economic crash that we've gone through, that we say we're recovering from, we're not going to recover from this. We can't recover from it. We can't go back to normal because normal is a failure. It's not a model. We've got to create something new. And we are at this point in time now when we're all beginning to wake up. The Arab Spring was an incredible wake-up call. The Occupy movement is an incredible wake-up call. The young people that I work with in China, MBA students there, and the future leaders of China, they're getting awoken. And in Latin America and throughout Europe, it's happening. We are waking up, and we've got to keep waking up. And I think before I go on, I want to talk a little bit more about what we all can do to wake up and to change this world, because we have to. For the sake of my grandson, his name is Grant, for Grant's sake, we have to wake up. And we have to realize that, again, for the first time in human history, Grant cannot have a sustainable, just, peaceful, and thriving world unless every child born in Botswana and Bolivia and in Palestine and Israel and in Indonesia and Tibet, unless every child on this planet of every sentient being has that same expectation of growing up in a sustainable, just, and peaceful world, and it's realized for all children. It has to be for all of us now. It has to be. We're beginning to understand that. How did we get here? And I think I'm in a position to talk a little bit about that because I was part of the problem as an economic hitman. What do economic hitmen do? And I was an economic hitman during the 70s, only for 10 years, but it was long enough to really understand this process. My official title was chief economist at a major consulting firm in Boston, Charles T. Main. But I was really a con man, and I had a staff of about 50 really good economists who could back up all of my con man activities with all the statistics as economists are so good at doing. My job was to identify countries that had resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its other financial organizations or a combination of them, but none of the money would actually ever go to that country. Instead, it would go to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in that country. You all know this scene, I'm sure. Things like power plants and industrial parks that would benefit a few wealthy people in these countries, as well as our own corporations that were the major beneficiaries, but wouldn't help the majority of the people because they can't afford electricity. Don't get jobs in industrial parks because industrial parks don't hire many people. And yet they would be left holding a huge debt, so big that they couldn't possibly repay it. At some point, we economic hitmen go back and say, hey, since you can't pay your debts, sell us your oil real cheap, without any social regulations or environmental regulations. Or vote with us on the next critical United Nations vote, or let us build a military base on your soil. And in the few cases where I failed, where we economic hitmen fail, what we call the jackals come in. The jackals either overthrow governments, like the government of Mossadegh in Iran, and most recently Zelaya in Honduras a couple of years ago, or they assassinate the leaders, Allende in Chile, many others. I talk in my books about how I failed with the president of Ecuador, democratically elected President Jaime Roldos, and I failed with the head of state of Panama, Omar Torrijos. I wasn't able to corrupt these men. I wasn't able to get them to accept these loans. They had integrity, and they both were killed in CIA assassinations. I saw this happen. This is the world that we created. And specifically, I want to talk a little bit about some of my experiences in the Muslim world and the corruption that went on there. My first job as an economic hitman was in Indonesia. This was 1971, and at that time Indonesia was in turmoil. And we had discovered oil in Indonesia, thought Indonesia had a tremendous amount of really good oil. It didn't turn out to be quite as good as we thought. But also Indonesia had the largest Muslim population in the world, as it still does, I believe. And we knew that we were losing in Vietnam, and we believed in this domino effect, that if Vietnam went, the next would be Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries. So my job was to go into Indonesia and win over the government, essentially enslave the government, because the government was teetering with Russia. So, you know, were they going to go with the Soviets or were they going to go with us? So my job was to go in and convince the government of Indonesia, from the president on down, that they should accept this huge loan to build electrical installations across the island of Java, where the main population is, and several of the other islands. And we knew, of course, that these electrical installations, big power plants, transmission lines, and distribution systems would be built by our companies. So the idea is that you get a loan from the World Bank, huge loan. Indonesia signs off on the loan using the oil that's under the ground as the collateral. Nobody's ever seen it. The money never goes to Indonesia. It goes from a bank in Washington, D.C. to one in Houston or San Francisco to Bechtel or Brown and Root or one of our big construction companies. The Indonesians never see this money. The U.S. corporation, or now a multinational corporation, goes to Indonesia and builds these power plants and transmission lines, and the Indonesians owe them all the money to the banks. And the electricity serves a few very wealthy families who own the big industries and the commercial establishments, the new shopping malls that were being built at that time, and the condominiums. But the people don't get it. The people's lands get destroyed, transmission lines run over them, power plants are built on them. The people don't get the electricity. Sometimes they try to steal it, and many of them die in the process. And the corruption involved in something like this is phenomenal. As we all know, tremendous amounts of corruption. And it's easy for us in the United States to say, oh, those corrupt governments in Tunisia or Indonesia or wherever, but we forget to ask, who the hell corrupted them? Me, us. We're the ones going over there. And I have to say that we had very strict laws, this is in the 70s in the United States, that I could not pay bribes to anybody, but I could hire expediters, Indonesian people, who are highly connected with the government, and pay them huge amounts of money and not ask where it was going. And the other thing that we could do, these subtle ways of corruption, so you let the president of the country know that if he signs off on this deal that's going to bankrupt his country eventually, put it in our hands, make it so that sometime they're going to have to work out deals where they basically sell off their utilities to our corporations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, let us build military bases, all of this. If he accepts that, then his brother-in-law, who owns the John Deere franchise, is going to get some very sweet deals. We're going to pay him $200 million for a contract that's only worth $100 million. That's not illegal. It's a bribe, but it's not an illegal bribe. And we're going to pay for the kids of him and all of his friends. We're going to give them scholarships. We're going to make sure they get into good universities in the United States and pay scholarships to them and give them jobs during the summer and vacations. Very sweet deals. And we'll even brag about that. My company did that. We gave scholarships all over the place to people in other countries, and we bragged about it. Yeah, we're giving all these scholarships to young kids from Indonesia and Colombia and Panama and all over. We never bothered to say that the only kids that got these scholarships were the children of extremely wealthy, extremely powerful individuals. We didn't bother to tell the public that. The public didn't want to know, I don't think. Corruption, tremendous amounts of it. And today we know that if you read the Transparency Index, Transparency, whatever the CPI, whatever it's called, many of the Islamic countries in the Middle East, and including Indonesia, are very low on the list. There's tremendous corruption. But I think we in the United States and in Europe have to take the credit for a great deal of that corruption. We fostered these systems. We created fake countries that weren't even there. We brought people into power, and we keep them in power. Mubarak is a great example. You know, I was shocked here in the United States to go around this country when Mubarak was being overthrown and hearing people say, well, but he's a democratically elected president. People in the United States didn't know that Mubarak was a dictator. It's amazing. It's shocking to me how uneducated we are, and I know you all have experienced that, and that's part of where the bigotry comes from. The second story I'd like to tell you is slightly different, because Indonesia was a country that needed money, so we could work that particular kind of deal in Indonesia. But the next story is about Saudi Arabia, which didn't need money. And in the early 70s, OPEC struck the United States pretty hard because of the rebelling against our outrageous policies with Israel, and had an oil embargo, which really brought us to our knees in the United States. The U.S. State Department came to me, the head of the Treasury Department came to me and a few other economic hitmen and said, hey, you know, we can't ever let this happen again. We can't be blackmailed by OPEC. Do something. Well, we knew that the something to do had to deal with Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia essentially controlled OPEC in those days. And we also knew that the House of Saud was very corrupt and very corruptible. And so I went off to Saudi Arabia with these other people, and to make a long story short, we struck this amazing deal with the House of Saud. And the deal basically went like this. It's a long deal, but to make it short, and it's described in detail in Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It's called the Saudi Arabia money laundering deal. And it went something like this, that we get Saudi Arabia to agree that it would always cooperate, and OPEC would cooperate with the big oil companies in setting oil prices, so they would work together, and they would never set a price that the oil companies weren't happy with. Not the customers, but the oil companies. And two, that they would only, and this is a very important one, wait, before I move into that one, the second one was that they would return most of the money they made by selling oil to the world to the U.S. Treasury Department by buying treasury bonds. And the interest from those bonds, Saudi Arabia would still own the bonds, but the interest would go to the U.S. Treasury Department to hire consulting firms to westernize Saudi Arabia, to build desalination plants and oil refineries and cities out of the desert, to westernize Saudi Arabia. And in fact, that's happened. Trillions of dollars have gone through this system. And the third point was, and this is a very important one, because Nixon had just taken the dollar off the gold standard. And so the dollar was floating around out there. Nobody was quite sure what was going to happen. So the demand was made that OPEC would agree to never sell oil for anything but US dollars, which essentially put the dollar on the oil standard, which of course has been one of the problems when anybody's objected to that, like Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi or the Iranians. We go after them because we're very protective of the US Federal Reserve and of the dollar. So we struck this deal with the House of Saud, and our end of the deal was, as long as you keep this deal, you're part of the deal, we'll protect you. We'll keep you in power. And we've done that. And so those are just two examples of the world that I was living in back in the 70s. And it's the world that's grown up around us here today. It's what's created this failure. And it is a world, I have to say, that is not controlled by any governments. It's controlled by big corporations. I think the realization that we all have to come to today is that we truly are in a new world, geopolitically speaking. Back a couple of hundred years ago, the geopolitics of the world was controlled pretty much by religious organizations. And then along came the powerful countries. Some were democracies, republics, and some were totalitarian, but they called the shots. But today we've moved into a new era, and it's the big corporations that are calling the shots. Let's face it, no major politician, with all due respect, gets elected in the United States or any of the other world so-called democracies without corporate support. Obama's proven this to us. And even if a politician were to get elected without any corporate support, he or she would still have to deal with today 35,000 corporate lobbyists in Washington, D.C. alone. The corporations own the mainstream media all over the world. They truly are in control. So during most of my lifetime, we could look at the globe, the world as this big globe with roughly 200 countries, of which a few had a lot of power, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, the United States at various times. But today we might better look at this planet as this big globe still with roughly 200 countries. But the real power base now could be better envisioned as these huge clouds drifting around the globe, the big corporations. They know no national boundaries. They don't follow any specific sets of laws. They strike partnerships and deals with the Chinese and the Taiwanese and the Tibetans, with the Pakistanis and the Indians, with the Palestinians and the Israelis. They don't care. They're calling the shots. They're running the show. We are in a new world, and most of us haven't gotten it. I talk a lot about this at MBA programs. I speak at Wharton and Stanford and many other MBA programs. I speak to corporate organizations. I'm headed to Istanbul next week to speak at a huge conference there of CEOs of big trading companies. It's amazing to me that these people are inviting me to talk to them. But they think the smart ones are getting it. You know, we were at a time, hi. Oh, it's not a gun, thank you. That's another story. Where was I? So I think we're at a time that's kind of similar to when the city-states became nations. And most people didn't get it, that was happening. But a few did. The Medici, they understood that it was no longer good enough to have a bank just in Florence. You needed to have one in Venice and Rome and Geneva. And we're at a time like that now. And the smart executives are beginning to understand that we've got to be sustainable. We've got to take care of each other. Because guess what? What happens to a species that isn't sustainable? It goes extinct. We're on that path. And the corporations are leading us down that path. And I tell them this, and by God, if you're a smart CEO, you don't want your corporation to lead you down that path. You're mentoring young people coming up. You want to take care of them. So I think the good news here is, and I want to get back for just a moment before I tell you the good news, about this corruption side of things. And when I saw the corruption, I worked in Egypt. God, I never saw such corruption as I discovered in Egypt. You know, I could tell you stories after stories, but one is I'm trying to raise all this money for Egypt to build. Well, this particular one was in Alexandria. We were going to do the water and sewage system, build a new water and sewage system for Alexandria, which actually was kind of nice. It actually would reach the people. And so to get the money, we had to do these forecasts of how the city of Alexandria was going to grow population-wise, how much, how many people were part of the city they were going to go to. And there's a census bureau, one government agency, you know, but I found that, and I was working for another government agency, I can't remember which one, I think planning, but, you know, they wouldn't cooperate with each other, and you had to make these huge payoffs somehow to the guy over here who had all the census data so that he could help the guy over here who wanted us to build these things. And of course, I couldn't make the payoffs because it was highly illegal. I never did anything illegal. I didn't, which is shocking. But I could hire someone and pay him a lot of money, an Egyptian at a high up level, and we all knew what he was doing, but nobody asked and he didn't tell us. But so this sort of thing goes on and on and on. And what I think is appalling in a way is how we in the United States just sort of sit back and we say, oh yeah, the problem with Africa, the problem with the Middle East, the problem with Latin America is corruption. Yes, but who's doing the corrupting? And I think we also forget that, in my opinion, we are the most corrupt country in the world. And I can get some debate on this, I'm sure. But the system that we have today, with the revolving doors, with the fact that someone can come out of being a chief executive officer in an oil company and then be in charge of the organization in Washington that supervises oil companies, and then go back into being chief executive officer of an oil company afterwards, that's corruption at the extreme. It's subtle, but it's corruption. It's a system that just is doomed to create more and more money for that famous 1%. It's a terrible system, and we know we need to fix it. In a system where we know that politicians have to receive tremendous amounts of money from corporations or they're not going to make it. In the Supreme Court passing Citizens United, you know, I'm involved in a movement to try to create the 28th Amendment to change that. But so this corruption thing is so endemic around the world today, and in my opinion, it's very strongly driven by the corporations. So the corporations are taking control of so much of this. But the good news is we are the corporations. You and I, we work for the corporations. We buy from the corporations. The corporations only exist and thrive because we support them. The marketplace is a democracy if we choose to make it one. Every time you buy something or choose not to, you're casting a vote. And I happen to think it's just as important as, or perhaps more important than, the vote you cast every 2 years or 4 years in a voting poll. And you do it every day or very frequently. It's an incredibly important tool. It's a vote, but you also have to express it. So for example, I happen to love Nike's products, but I won't buy them because I've seen the sweatshops in Indonesia where slaves work for Nike. So I don't buy Nike products, and I used to be a consultant to Nike. And so I send Nike, I know the people there, but you don't need to know them. You can send an email. Somebody mentioned earlier today the importance of that. I send an email to Nike and say, I want to wear that swoosh or swish or swash or whatever it is with pride, saying that this represents a responsible firm, but I can't do that today. Pay those people in Indonesia decent salaries, give them health care and pensions for retirement, and I'll buy Nike. We must do that. And send an email to the company that I do buy from and tell them how much I appreciate what they're doing. We have tremendous power, you and I, to change these things. We know what's going on in the Middle East today. I can only imagine the behind-the-scenes shenanigans of economic hitmen and jackals that's happening in Egypt right now, and of course in Syria and Tunisia, all of those countries. I can only begin to imagine. We know what's going on, and it's being corporate-driven more than anything else. The U.S. government, the State Department, the CIA are essentially tools of big corporations. I've been to a lot of U.S. embassies, and I know if I walk in that door as John Perkins, U.S. citizen, I'm hardly going to get the time of day. If I lost my passport, they'll help me get a new one. But if I go in as John Perkins, CEO of a corporation or top consultant to some big corporation, I get to see the ambassador. It's a fact. The corporations are driving this, but you and I drive the corporations. So here we are at this remarkable time in history. And I think it's important for us to really get these facts down and to understand this system that we're living in today, because it is what's impacting the Middle East and all the rest of the world. And we have the power over it. As we think about the Middle East, let's look back to when I was in college and there was apartheid in South Africa. And we boycotted the corporations that supported it. Apartheid ended. I went to business school in Boston and I couldn't walk beside the Charles River. It was too stinking with pollution. And rivers in Ohio were on fire with pollution. We forced corporations to clean them up. We forced corporations to open their doors wider to women and minorities, and more recently to get trans fats pretty much out of foods and antibiotics out of chickens. We've had a lot of success with these corporations. Today, we've got to take a big step forward. And what we need to realize is this is not a conspiracy theory at all. These corporations, most of the leaders don't even know each other. What I call the corporatocracy, the heads of the big corporations are calling the shots. But it's not a conspiracy, but they're all driven by one single goal: maximize profits regardless of the social and environmental costs. Not the goal I was taught in the late 60s when I went to business school. I was told a good CEO makes good rates of return for his investors, but he also takes good care of his employees, gives them health care and retirement pensions. They did that back then. And takes good care of his customers and his suppliers, and is a good community citizen, enjoys paying taxes. Imagine. During World War II, our corporations paid about 52% of the US tax base. Last year it was about 7%. GE made huge profits and got something like a $2.5 billion rebate. Paid no taxes. Exxon also. It's disgusting, and you wouldn't think these corporations would want to do that now. That's not what I was taught in business school, but in the 70s, along comes Milton Friedman, the Chicago School of Economics, and says none of that's important. The only thing a corporation must do is maximize profits. It changed everything. Every corporation's bought into this. We need to turn that around. We need to tell these corporations, hey, listen, we want you to get a good rate of return on for your investors, because that's the only way you're going to get investors. I'm a capitalist. But do it only within the context of creating a world grant my grandson is going to want to grow up in. Let those be the parameters. Let us speak out to these corporations and say, make your profits and be good public servants. Create a sustainable, just, peaceful world, and one that's thriving for all sentient beings on this planet. Make your profit, but within that context. And I'll tell you what, this country, my country, your country, has precedent for this. For the first 100 years, the United States was a nation. No corporation could get a charter in any state unless it demonstrated that it was going to serve a public interest. Charters lasted on average 10 years, and then the corporation had to go back and prove it had served a public interest and would continue to do so. That all ended in the late 1800s when the Supreme Court decided that corporations had the rights but not the responsibilities of individuals. It's gotten worse ever since. That Citizens United case is one case in point. I think we need to go back to that value system that says corporations are here not to serve that 1%, but to serve us, to serve a public interest. I can't see any reason why that shouldn't be the case. And it isn't just the public interest of the United States, because we all know now we're living on this space station. It's got to serve the public interest of every sentient being on this planet. And that's the time we're in today. This is a huge issue. We've come together here as bridges between various communities of faith and philosophy, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism. We come together. And we come together knowing that there's a huge problem in the Middle East today and a huge awakening. And how do we deal with that? How do I, as an American citizen, relate to that? What do I tell my Congress people? Yes, that's terribly important. But the bigger issue that's beyond all of that, that's the umbrella issue, is how do we truly deal with ourselves as we go into this period, recognizing that we're a very, very fragile species living on a tiny, tiny planet, and we must come together. We must come together to create a world that Grant will want to live in, and knowing that that means every child. So I'm going to bring this to an end pretty soon, but I did a couple of things I wanted to talk about what each of us can do individually, and just see if there's anything else that I might have left out that I wanted to talk about. One thing. I'd like to stay in touch with all of you, and I have a website, johnperkins.org. It's pretty easy. And a newsletter that comes out about twice a month. Please subscribe. You have to actually put your email address in there. And I am on Facebook, although maybe I'm thinking I ought to get off. However, since I'm not Muslim, maybe it's okay that I stay on. And isn't that a disgusting thought? So I'm on Facebook and Twitter, economic_hitman. So I just want to leave you with this thought of what is it that you can do? What is it that each of us can do as individuals? And I know a lot of you are already doing incredible things, and supporting this organization is a very, very important part of that process. And everything that you do in terms of how you shop and so on and so forth, you all know all of that, and supporting more organizations. But I want to just say that the very most important thing each of you can do is to follow your passions and use the talents that you have. And if we all use our individual passions, I don't know what yours are. I know I have a passion for writing and hopefully some talent in it. I don't know what your passions and talents are, but I know you have them. And if we all use our passions and talents to do something every single day, something, send an email, something, go out and demonstrate on the streets, whatever it is, small email, big demonstrate, whatever. But if we all use our individual passions and our individual talents, and we all head for the same destination of creating a sustainable, just, and peaceful world for Grant, then we'll get there. So look to your passions, look to your talents. How do we move in that direction? As a student of the American Revolution, growing up in New Hampshire and New England, I used to think, my God, aren't we grateful that Tom Paine didn't try to lead armies, and George Washington didn't write pamphlets. Paine had a passion and talent for writing pamphlets. Washington had a passion and talent for leading men. Martha Washington had a passion and talent for organizing women to make clothes for the men at the forefront. They were all very different passions and talents, but they all headed for the same destination of getting out from under the British yoke. And they got there. So we can all have very different routes to take. We can all have different passions and talents, but if we all follow them and we all come together to head for that same destination of creating a sustainable, just, peaceful world, a world that's thriving for all sentient beings, a world my grandson and yours will want to grow up in, we will get there. And I'm just going to read a quick quote, okay? I don't think my time's quite up yet. Quick quote. Okay, this is relevant, I think, and then I'll shut up. I think this is very relevant to these times, although it's more than 200 years old. It comes from the American Revolution. And I think it's important to understand, You know, George Washington, Martha Washington, Tom Jefferson, they were traitors. They were terrorists. They would have been hanged if they had lost the revolution. They really stuck their necks out, quite literally. And Washington was probably the wealthiest man in the United States, or wasn't the United States yet. Really stuck their necks out, these people. And it lost every battle. At the beginning of the war, for a couple of years, Washington lost almost every battle. The Continental Congress didn't back him, didn't give him shoes, didn't give him ammunition. It was dire. They were losing badly. So along in December 1776 comes Tom Paine. And I think this is so relevant to us right now, to each of us, to you. Paine said, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he who stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. A generous parent should say, 'If there must be trouble, let it be in my day that my child may have peace. If there must be trouble, let it be in our day that our children may have peace.'" Paine continues, "I love the man and woman who can smile in trouble, who can gather strength from distress and grow brave by reflection. By perseverance and fortitude, we have the prospect of a glorious future. By perseverance and fortitude, we have the prospect of a glorious future." I think the reason that we're all here tonight, Muslim and Christian and Jew and whatever else is represented in this room, people from many different countries, I think the reason we're here tonight is so that Grant can look back 60 years from now and say, "Thank God, thank Allah, those people had dinner together that night, and every one of them committed to going out and taking action every day to creating a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. Thank Allah, thank God, thank you." Questions, right. Oh, yeah. Uh-oh.
How can we change our corrupt system? Is it by working individually, collectively? I think they're referring to corrupt systems across the seas. Yeah.
Yes, it's working individually and collectively and every way. It really is following the passion. I mean, I often get a question when I lecture at business schools from students saying, well, should I go and work for a big corporation and try to change it from inside, or should I join some nonprofit or some radical movement and try to change it from the outside? And the answer is yes, whichever your passion takes you. Because let's face it, if you don't follow your passion, you're not going to be successful. You may make money, but you're not going to have a happy life. The only way to be truly prosperous is to follow your passion, and that's where success comes. So if you're so moved to work individually, work individually. If you're moved to work in community, work in community. If you want to work from inside corporations, do that. But don't let them corrupt you. Bring them around. And if you want to work from outside them, that's the way too. That's it. Thank you.
I'm sure many of you still have questions for Mr. Perkins. Please, he'll be around. Just catch him and there, yes, that's true. So there are 2 books for sale. If you have a copy of Confessions of Economic Hitman or any of his other books, he can sign them. If not, you should definitely pick up some of his books. They're really fascinating.